So, I suggested that we watch these two talks, both, well, different from one another, but both about the same topic, which is the way that the two sides of the brain, the two cerebral hemispheres, work, how they relate to our knowledge, what the different kinds of consciousness, if you like, or the different kinds of thinking, you can say that, that these two cerebral hemispheres, how they work. And it's really very striking. In both, actually, you saw images of the brain. One, you saw a real brain, which is quite dramatic, and how very sharply divided it is. You know, that there's this large mass of the two cerebral hemispheres, and only at the very base of those two is there a join between them. There was a few, I think in the 1970s, an article that I read, a philosophical article about people who had had that connection between the two halves of the brain cut. And very strange things are observed. I won't go into all the details, but it seems clear that each side of the brain is able to function. In fact, there are some people whose left or right hemisphere is completely disabled for life, and they are still able to function. But they work in different ways. They seem, to put it very crudely, they think differently. And as Iain McGilchrist says, you know, that this has got a bit, the topic, which was very hot particularly in the 1970s, I think, has got less fashionable in psychology because a lot of the generalizations that people used to make about the left and right hemispheres were not really correct. The right hemisphere was said to be the visual hemisphere, and the left hemisphere, the verbal hemisphere. It's not like that. Both are involved in both. But what it seems is that the big difference between them is that the right hemisphere has to do with holistic thinking, divergent thinking, taking in a complete scene and somehow generating an awareness of that scene as a whole. And the left hemisphere is about analyzing detailed, convergent thinking. It's also about sort of pragmatic thinking, you know, problem solving, whereas the right hemisphere is much more like an intuitive a way of dealing with the world. And Jill Bolte Taylor talks beautifully about the different experience of those, and how the left hemisphere is very busy. It's concerned with past and future. It thinks about the past. It's got all those memories, and then it's also got lots of plans and expectations about the future, and it's manipulating those and trying to construct our ideal future and how we're going to make that happen. Whereas the right hemisphere is absolutely in the present moment. And it doesn't concern itself with past or future at all. It's not really aware of that at all. But it's very, very aware of what's happening right now. Whereas the left hemisphere has almost no awareness of that. Because all it's doing is thinking about, it's using information from the past to plan the future. I don't know how many of you know Eckhart Tolle's teachings and his book, The Power of Now. At the beginning of that book, he talks about his enlightenment experience. I think we can call it that. He doesn't use that word, but for the benefit of those who don't know the story, he was a Cambridge academic, a literature don. I think he was a research fellow, actually. He was fairly much near the beginning of his academic career, but obviously extremely bright, and very intellectual. And he suffered a great deal from depression, which is relevant. He says that he had this continual conversation going on in his head, and it was stressing him and upsetting him. And one day he was walking along the street in Cambridge, and there was a woman coming towards him who was talking to herself continually. Nowadays, it wouldn't attract any attention because he would assume she's on a hands-free mobile phone. But in those days, this was something unusual. And he looked at me and thought, oh, goodness me, she's pretty far gone. The kind of the snap judgment that people used to make about anybody like that who would talk to themselves all the time in public is that, well, they're mad. They have a mental health problem. And he was saying, oh, that's terrible. And he got to the college, and he was in the toilets of the college, and he was washing his hands. And this conversation was going on in his head. And he suddenly realized, he looked in the mirror, that he was talking out loud to himself. My God, it's happened to me, So he had this obsessional inner conversation. He couldn't stop all the time. And one night, he was sitting there with this going on, this obsessional thoughts going on, and he couldn't stop. And he had the thought, I can't live with myself any longer. And he said the next thought was, well, if I can't live with myself, there must be two of me, and maybe one of them isn't real. And at that moment, he said, everything changed. And, that conversation completely stopped, and he had a different experience altogether, so profoundly different from anything he'd ever experienced, that he was subsequently unable to remember it at all. And after some hours, he kind of came back down enough to be able to recall what his experience was like. And he said everything was totally different. It's like he'd been living in a black and white world and gray world, and now everything was suddenly in vibrant color. The conversation that was going on in his head had stopped, and he was experiencing joy in the present moment. And he said he was in this state of euphoric bliss for about 2 years. He dropped out of his college job. He said he was, spending his days and nights on park benches in a state of continuous bliss. And gradually, he began to reconnect with the world and started looking at spiritual teachings, and eventually became a spiritual teacher and wrote The Power of Now, which is one of the best-selling spiritual books of all time. And what I'm leading up to is the main message of The Power of Now is that through a learning to bring our awareness completely into the present moment, we can let go of all of our anxiety and fears. We can experience joy. We can, essentially, this is. I mean, he now does talk about enlightenment. His more recent book called Stillness Speaks is he is subtitled A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment, and in that book particularly, he's giving instruction how we can quieten down and silence the conceptual mind that continually thinks in words about the past and future, is always making plans, has all kinds of anxieties and fears about the future, all kinds of regrets and resentment about the past, and is not connected with what is actually happening right now. And an observation that he makes, which I think is rather important, is that although the conceptual thinking mind, which here we're talking, this is connected with the left hemisphere of the brain, is able to do it's very adept at doing mechanical calculation and deduction, that kind of logical thinking, if you like, reasoning. But if what we might call creative intelligence, it cannot do at all. That is a function of the intuitive mind, the right brain, and it is there only in the present moment that we can move our thinking beyond where it's been before. Otherwise, all we can do is apply what we think we already know to, working out a new answer using that information. But the information that's coming to us right now in the present moment, we can't access with the left brain at all. And there's a beautiful example in Iain McGilchrist's talk of people, because it's possible to experimentally deactivate one side of the brain. So you can do experiments on people and find out how they respond to different things. Very interesting, some of the experiments he talks about. And one of them is where people who've had their right side of their brain deactivated, so this is the intuitive side, the holistic thinking side, they're shown cards with logical syllogisms, right? And asked whether the conclusion of the syllogism is true. So the example he gives is, all monkeys climb trees. The porcupine is a monkey, therefore the porcupine climbs trees. And invariably, people whose left hemisphere is working and their right hemisphere is not working, they say, that's true. Porcupines climb trees. The same people, when you ask them separately, do porcupines climb trees? They say no, because they have that information, they know that. And then you say, but what about this? And they're a bit puzzled, and they say, but that's what it says on the card. They cannot see the problem. The problem is that the second premise, of course, is false. It's not true that the porcupine is a monkey. But they don't see that. They see that the argument is that the syllogism is correct. The conclusion does follow from the two premises. They don't see that actually one of those premises isn't correct. But anyway, what I'm getting at is they can reason mechanically, but they can't criticize their own reasoning. Now, this seems to me to have a lot of bearing on the present situation in the world. We're talking about the ecological crisis that we were talking about before. Whether it applies especially to the present crisis with coronavirus is an interesting question. We might want to discuss that in the discussion. I think it does, but be interesting to see what people think. But with the ecological crisis, it's like, well, the way that we've been doing things, the kind of structures that we've created, and structure is very much a left brain thing, don't seem to allow us to respond to the situation that we find ourselves in, that our industrial activities and other activities are destroying the natural world. And we have a problem. We, as a species, we're not adapting because, and I think this is not, of course, an absolute generalization. It's not the only explanation, but a big part of the explanation is that we are stuck in left brain thinking, and we are using information and ideas and knowledge that we have from the past to solve problems that are occurring in the present that are different in nature. In order to solve those problems, we need our right hemisphere to be in charge. So the book, Iain McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, the title is taken from this story that he gives. I thought it was a Chinese story. He says it's from Nietzsche, that there's a wise spiritual teacher who is also the ruler of a kingdom, essentially, you know, and he realizes that he needs some help. He needs to delegate some of the work to somebody else. For whatever reason, perhaps he needs to go into meditation or something. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, or maybe it's part of the kingdom. I think in one of the story versions of the story, it's a part of the kingdom that's a bit remote, and he sends this person off, who's quite knowledgeable and and experienced and so on, to look after that part of the kingdom. And after a while, this emissary, the person he's sent out, starts to think, he has the wisdom that the master has. And he takes charge without kind of consulting the master about things. And things all start to go badly wrong. And the analogy that he's making is what we've done. The left brain, which should be the servant of the right brain. And there's a quote from Einstein, I think, to that effect. Einstein said, the rational mind needs to be the servant of the intuitive mind. So in our civilization now, Iain McGilchrist makes this point quite strongly, that in our civilization, essentially, we have made the left brain, the master, put the left brain in charge. And the left brain, as I've said, cannot critique its own thinking. and it works with representations of the world. It creates a representation of what's going on, but it can't differentiate between the representation, the map, if you like, and the actual reality, the landscape that the map is a map of. Now, they're totally different. A map is not a piece of territory. It's very clear, isn't it? It's not a physical landscape. It's a picture of it. It's a representation of it. But the left brain cannot differentiate those. The conceptual mind confuses its own concept, its own mental image or idea of reality with the reality itself. Whereas the right brain experiences reality essentially directly. So in meditation, it's very interesting, isn't it, when we think about this, that what we do typically in meditation is we use various techniques such as watching the breath and so on to slow down and quieten down that analyzing, thinking, conceptual mind, and allow our awareness to just be what it is and to notice what's happening, and also to be aware of being aware, if you like. So that state of being, that state of consciousness, I would say is very strongly associated with the right hemisphere of the brain. And I've just been actually doing some reading of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I wanted to get back to the, this is really where the teachings of emptiness, the Mahayana teachings of emptiness of all phenomena, not just emptiness of the personal self, but emptiness of everything, really comes from this sutra, the series of sutras. We know the Heart Sutra, which is the smallest one. I'm reading the longer one. And what it seems to be constantly, directing you towards is the conceptual mind's representation of reality is not real. What the conceptual mind apprehends as reality is not reality. And reality is empty, devoid of those characteristics, particularly things being separate from one another. And the individual, of course, the personal self, being separate from other personal selves and from the rest of the world, from phenomena. Okay. So the right hemisphere, as Jill Bolte Taylor describes so eloquently and beautifully, I think, it does not experience reality like that. It experiences itself, if you like, although it doesn't distinguish between itself and everything. It experiences just being part of or being one with this whole. She talks about, the energy of I am the energy of the universe in a particular form, of course, but there isn't a differentiation between me and that. Okay, there's no what we call dualism. The right hemisphere experiences reality non-dualistically. So in meditation, I think a lot of the work that we are doing is attempting to connect with that right hemisphere form of experience. And as I say, I think, Eckhart Tolle's teachings are a very good example, because he had this dramatic, shift, which is not altogether, different from how Jill Bolte Taylor describes her experience, where her left hemisphere was completely deactivated. She only had the right hemisphere. He didn't have that. His left hemisphere was still able to kind of do, basic practical things, which the right hemisphere on its own cannot do that. If you have a left hemisphere so drastic that your left hemisphere is put out of action completely, you can't really do much. But certainly he had you know, that one of the things I haven't really said, but it's obviously implied by a lot of things that I've said and those other people have said, is that at times the left hemisphere is dominant, it's in charge. And at other times, the right hemisphere is in charge, is dominant. Particularly, Iain McGilchrist says, and this is very clear, when we are in a situation that is very new, that we haven't experienced before, the left hemisphere cannot access its banks of information and try to figure out what to do. So it has to give way to the right hemisphere, which responds, is able to take in the situation, that this is what's happening and this is how I need to respond. And so the right hemisphere becomes dominant. And we notice that if we go to a foreign country that we've never been to before, especially if we can't speak the language, you know, we have a very vivid experience of being present. You know, everything's kind of, oh, bright colors. We remember very strongly what happened because the right hemisphere is active, being aware of what's going on right now. We're not just caught up in this enmeshed in this sort of matrix of my history and my plans for the future and how I'm going to put them into practice, and you know, so that we're just not aware of what's going on right now. You see what I mean? So we alternate between left hemisphere and right hemisphere dominance. And also, Iain McGilchrist points out, as a civilization, we do the same thing. By the way, I just mentioned, you know, his book is in 2 parts. It's a long book, and it's extremely worth reading. It's a difficult book. So, you know, if you want to make do with the soundbite version, the talk is brilliant summary of what the book says. But the book itself is about 700 or 800 pages, and it's in 2 parts. And the first part is about the psychology and physiology of the 2 sides of the brain, in great detail, because he did many years of research on it. But he was originally not a scientist, he was a humanities person, he was a literature specialist. And the second half of the book is all about the history of European civilization and culture considered from this point of view. And he writes about how the great civilizations, you know, the Greek and Roman empires and the civilization of the Renaissance in Europe, began with an explosion of right hemisphere thinking, creativity, integrative thinking, holistic thinking. And gradually, over time, it got more and more dominated by left hemisphere thinking until that creativity had got lost. The ability of that civilization to respond creatively to new situations was lost, and the civilization disintegrated and collapsed. And I think it's very clear that this is the situation we're in now. And I think that at that time, I think as a response to that crisis situation, creative thinking and more spiritual modes of awareness begin to have a resurgence. And so these are, I think, this, you know, understanding, or this, I mean, it is, none of these things are to be taken as dogmas. Dogma is the province of the left brain. So, you know, if we could get too stuck in having this idea, oh, everything's about the left and right brain. We have very fixed ideas about what those are. And then, of course, we're in a left brain mode of thinking. We're going to get into trouble. So we need to keep this fluid and flexible and recognize it's just one way of looking at things. But I think it's an extremely useful and insightful way of looking at things and looking at the situation that we're in now. And I will come back to that next time, because next time I'm going to talk about Gaia, the Gaia theory, which is a holistic view of the Earth, the ecosystem, and you know, the interaction between the physical world and the system of life on the planet, and how we can think of the system of life as one integrated whole, like a single organism. That is a very right brain idea, but of course, you know, the interesting thing about it is that it's come from pure science. I mean, some people think it's a kind of fluffy sort of alternative kind of new agey idea, but it is based on very, very tough, rigorous scientific analysis as well. So it's actually perhaps, you know, one of the areas where the left and right brain are coming together. Now, they clearly need to come together. And just one final point that I was interested, Iain McGilchrist, we started at the beginning by saying how very strongly divided the two hemispheres of the brain are. And there's just this small sort of connecting tissue at the bottom. And he says it's 300, Jill Bolte Taylor says actually that it's 300 million cells, axon cells of nerve cells of the brain, which is a tiny number compared to the whole total number of cells in the brain. And that, according to Iain McGilchrist, those connecting fibers have been getting less and less in proportion to the size of the brain throughout human evolution. It's very interesting. Our brains have been getting more divided over time. But it seems to me that the spiritual work of moving towards enlightenment is, if we look at it from this point of view, is very much to do with integrating the two sides. So first of all, activating and the right hemisphere mode of awareness and quietening down the left, so that we can get into this awareness, direct awareness of reality without concepts getting in the way and confusing what is reality. And then integrating the two sides together. So that's ultimate truth, obviously. Then conventional truth, we know this is about the detail of everything, and how we practically act in the world. Integrating those two, so compassion and wisdom. Compassion is interesting, mentioned by Jill Bolte Taylor, who really does speak in very Buddhist language about her experience, doesn't she? And that's interesting. I think it was kind of an enlightenment experience, and she seems to me to be a very enlightened person. I think that'll probably do for the time being. Just I thought that was interesting, that our brains have been getting more divided. Not sure quite what that tells us, but I'll leave it there and we can open that up for discussion. I'll just pause the recording there.